This little talk is entitled A Drug Solution. What does that mean? I'm here to give you the solution to the drug problem. Kind of. But really, it came from the mouth of a recovering addict last summer when I attended the governor's opioid summit. He got up in the middle of a bunch of people where the governor was in attendance and said, I hear a lot about the drug problem, having a drug problem. I didn't have a drug problem. I had a drug solution. I was addicted to drugs because it was a solution to a problem. And the problem was what we just heard about, emptiness and isolation and loneliness and psychic pain. So that's what the title really is all about. So I open with also a quote from what I feel compelled, to call our president, Captain Obvious, Donald J. Trump. The best way to prevent drug addiction and overdose is to prevent people from abusing drugs in the first place, he said. If they don't start, they won't have a problem. If they do start, it's awfully hard to get off. Thank you, President Obvious. I mean, there's some wisdom there too, but of course, it sounds ridiculous coming from those lips. But unless you've been living under a rock, you know there's an opioid addiction raging. We're in the midst of losing thousands and thousands of people to opioid and just opioids, not to mention all the other drugs and alcohol. I won't bombard you with the stats, but the numbers are sobering, and they demand our attention. That attention includes blowing up old ways of thinking about addiction and seeking new ways to prevent and treat addiction, because he's truly right. The best way to prevent a death or addiction is to prevent kids and young people and old people, prevent people from beginning in the first place, because it is awfully hard to get off once you're started. The number of overdose deaths related to heroin alone increased 533% from 2002 to 2016. Just to heroin, we lost 13,219 plus or minus last year. Opioid overdose deaths are the leading cause of death for people under the age of 50 in this country now. About 68,000 people last year we lost to just opioid overdose deaths. And it's not all the fault of an evil medical system, though some of the blame can certainly be laid at the feet of prescribers and what my friend Dr. Norm Shealy calls the pharmacomafia. Here's the thing. At least 3/4 of opioid pill abusers and almost all heroin addicts got hooked without ever having been prescribed anything by a physician or a nurse practitioner. Emergency room records show only a fraction, that is about 13% of opioid overdose victims began taking drugs because of pain. So actually small percentage. There's a little bit of a red herring there. People try to lay it at the feet of prescribers starting. There's something much more fundamental wrong than that, than just having people who went to medical school doling out medications. It's something much more fundamental than that. The media feature many stories about patients who need painkillers later became addicts, but actually those are rather the exceptions than the rule. So what if the main roots of addiction are somewhere entirely else? They're not in the drugs themselves. What if it's something more or different than that? What if it's not some mysterious biological imperative or disease process? Hungarian-born Canadian physician Gabor Mate said it beautifully and provocative when I heard him speak at a behavioral health conference last year. All drugs of abuse either treat or distract from pain. So the question is, again, not why the addiction, but rather, why the pain? Where's the pain coming from? And clearly, we're not just talking about some physical pain related to a broken bone or fibromyalgia or whatever. We're talking about something more fundamental than that. My belief is that the pain comes from, primarily, the root cause of the pain is from disconnection. What we heard from the wisdom lesson. Emptiness, disconnection from self, from others, from some meaningful purpose. Some of the early public service announcements, you remember them, most of you in the room, on drug abuse, focused heavily on studies that had been done in the 1970s where they had the rat in the cage. And if you remember those, you recall the rat in the cage with the 2 bottles with the little nipples on them. And those were from real studies, where they had a wire cage with rats in them and 2 nipples for them to drink from. One had water, and the other had water laced with cocaine or heroin. Well, guess what happened? Those rats, given the emptiness of an existence in a wire cage and a couple of options, they used a lot of drugs. Those rats got high, and those rats overdosed and died at a very high rate. Think about that, though. Are you really surprised by that? Wouldn't you? Most of us would, given that alternative. And those PSAs were based on that. And I would never be one to argue for any kind of prevention message that keeps kids from trying it for the first time. Those work in some cases. So far be it from me to argue against that. But those studies were, how should I say it? If I was teaching a research class, I would say those studies lacked ecological validity or external validity. They didn't look anything like the real world, in a way. Well, a Canadian psychologist named Dr. Bruce Alexander from Simon Fraser University looked at those studies and thought the same thing. Like, maybe that's not a full explanation for addiction. That the drug, basically the message was, the drug causes the addiction, right? But he replicated those studies, but made them perhaps more ecologically valid, in a sense. So he said, what if rats had a pretty cool life? What if they had a nice pad, where you could have the wheels to run on and food and rat playmates and places to make rat love. They had a little bachelor. So he created this massive, 200 times the size of a normal cage, complex where you might call it rat heaven instead of rat park. And then replicated those studies with the same things available, the water and the drug-laced water. And guess what happened? They enjoyed their lives. They consumed a fraction of the amount of drugs, and they didn't die. So think about that for a second. What does that speak to the extent that humans and rats can be compared? And I did a little comparative psychology work in graduate school, and there's a lot of correspondence, actually. So to the extent that we can generalize that, what does that mean? Well, of course, it seems to argue for something other than a biological imperative for addiction or some disease process that makes it some craven, difficult thing to ever kick and so forth. And think about that from the perspective of the research. It's a very particular kind of study. And there will be those who will always say, well, those are rats and we're humans and we're so much more evolved. Yeah. Well, as fate would have it, there was something of a natural experiment going on at the same time called the Vietnam War, where you had folks who were in metal cages, so to speak. They were in horrific abjectly terrifying circumstances. And not surprisingly, a whole bunch of those soldiers, at least a third of them, probably more than that, but at least a third of them in the research, were addicted to heroin, other easily available drugs in Vietnam. And again, I think I would have been maybe among that one-third of folks in that wire cage. There was a bunch of folks addicted to heroin and other substances in Vietnam. And so the thought was, what's going to happen when those guys and gals come home? Well, we're going to have them running through the streets or, haunting the streets, a bunch of drug addicts, with needles hanging from their arms, and hundreds of thousands of them. Guess what happened, though? It didn't happen. When they came home, after they got through the being spit upon by certain protesters calling them baby killers and such, when they got home, they were received typically by their communities. And they got back to their families, and they reconnected with their purposes and their communities, and most of them just quit. They didn't bring home stockpiles of heroin. They didn't keep buying heroin on the street. They came home and stopped using drugs because they were no longer in that wire cage and meaningless existence, as it might have felt to them. They just stopped, most of them. Some needed treatment. And again, I'm not going to oversimplify this thing, but I think in large part we have missed the main roots in some fashion. I believe the active ingredient of what caused them to stop was pretty simple. Reconnecting, re-engaging, and finding meaningful human connection. Again, not arguing for some overly simplistic view of addiction, but I have come to believe, as has the much maligned, sometimes maligned journalist and author Johann Hari, who wrote the book Chasing the Screen, as Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate seems to have come to in his work, that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but it is rather connection. No man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. John Donne wrote. If that's so, and I believe it is fundamental truth, we are all connected in the most literal as well as figurative ways imaginable. Then what we must do here, what we have to do is to, as Thich Nhat Hanh has said, awaken from the illusion of our separateness. Our sense of being separate from others, what Buddhists often call the illusion of separateness, is really a psychosocial construct. It's a highfalutin way of saying something we made up. Composed of habitual ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, and creating the false impression that we are separate from everyone and everything else in the known universe. Our five senses lead us to adopt that objective frame of mind, and therefore to a fundamental misunderstanding of our own world, the construction of a me inside something truly, truly separate, requires the construction of an external, objective world experienced as not me, as outside of me, as external, as other than me. As I said earlier, we've invested heavily in this, what I believe is a sort of mistaken construction of our world. Consider the fact that psychologists tend to hold up as the paragon of mental health those who have good boundaries, and who are individuated with a strong sense of self. Yeah, there's something to be said for that. And yet, the psychologist that was quoted earlier, Carl Jung, same guy who gave us that concept of individuation, becoming an individual, also at the very same time gave us the concept of the collective unconscious, which is an idea firmly rooted in our infinitely connected universe. The idea that we are all part of a same consciousness. Same guy. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Are you both of those at the same time? Yeah. Sorry. Wish it was simpler. We have some thinking to do about all this, I would say. This duality of a me separate from the universe, separate from others, is at the root of so much of human suffering. That's patently obvious. Why? Because the supposedly separate self is always insecure. How could it not be? So we keep trying to secure ourselves with things outside of us. That's the hunger. That's the hunger of the individuated self. To always be seeking to tether itself to something outside. The things we crave give us a clue to that. Money, possessions, including guitars, I would hasten to add. Although that feels more like part of me, but okay, I guess it's truly outside of me. Reputation, numbers of Facebook followers, whatever. It seems tragic yet inevitable that these kinds of attempts to solve the problem of insecurity often reinforce the sense that there is a me separate from others. Like a thirsty person drinking salt water, just makes us want more and more and more, as we sang about earlier. I've said this publicly lots of times, and I'll keep saying it. I believe we're living through something of an epidemic of another kind, of loneliness and isolation. Perhaps worse than it's ever been. Ironically, counterintuitively, maybe worse than it's ever been in an era where there are more ways to connect than there have ever been, in a sense. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're experiencing concurrently an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths related to those addictions. I don't think that's a coincidence. They've both been called by authorities other than Donald J. Trump public health crises. That is addiction as well as loneliness and isolation. It's worth noting further that the root cause, if I do a root cause analysis, every suicide I ever reviewed during my days at Burrell revealed a ubiquitous sense of lack of belonging and a sense of burdensomeness. Those are the two fundamental themes that you could almost always count on when you reconstruct the psychological state of people before they died by suicide, which also involved, in at least 70% of cases, addiction and substance use and alcohol abuse. The fundamental root cause analysis reveals people die because of lack of belonging and feeling like a burden. Well, the antidote to both of those risk factors, the protective factor, as public health people would say, the protective factor that counterbalances and neutralizes those risk factors is a sense of meaningful connection with others and with the world and with one's own purpose, which almost always involves other people or animals, as the case may be, or both. So often, addiction and death by suicide are failures of imagination. They are failures of imagination. A failure to be able to awaken from the illusion of our separateness from each other and to connect in ways that are nourishing and sustaining and meaningful and life-giving. When we can awaken to the idea that there's only a fundamental unity, then the idea that we are somehow separate from the outside environment and from each other begins to fade. The only limits to that consciousness, that awareness, is our imagination. That's why I call it a failure of imagination. So I'm grateful today, even at the end of one of the most difficult weeks of my entire life. I'm grateful. And I acknowledge my starriness, that I am made of the same stuff as the heart of the stars, as are each of you, my friends. I'm grateful to be with you on this incredible journey, which sometimes makes us almost unable to put one foot in front of the other because of the pain of it. But nonetheless, I'm grateful to be here with you on this journey. In a world that can appear so mean, so bleak, so tasteless and colorless, and yet simultaneously bloom into incredible beauty in the blink of an eye.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.